Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeoviking. Today is the second video I'm doing for this year's Black History Month. The subject of today's video is the history of the Afro-Creole people of Louisiana. Now, right off the bat, I'm sure everyone here watching, especially those in the United States, are very familiar with the state Louisiana, especially as it pertains to the city of New Orleans and things such as Mardi Gras and Louisiana Voodoo, again, especially pertaining to New Orleans, specifically with the French Quarter of New Orleans. However, this is not the whole picture of the deep, complex culture uh, and diverse mix of cultural groups that exists within um, and that exists within uh, Louisiana and, of course, by proxy, New Orleans. So, right off the bat, one of the first things we need to do is define the term Creole, because those of you watching and listening may not be aware of what this term actually means. So, the term Creole is a phrase describing any person of European descent, mostly French or Spanish, and or African descent, born in the West Indies or other parts of the French and Spanish colonies in the Americas. And therefore, these individuals are naturalized in those regions rather than in their parents' home country. All right, so with that out of the way, we are going to take a look at the history of the Afro-Creole people. Real quick uh, content warning. There will be a couple of times where very disturbing instances are mentioned in the video, so including sexual assault. So be forewarned. All right, so first we are going to take a look at the Afro-Creole people in the colonial South. So the history of the Afro-Creole people really begins in 1685 CE when the French king created what was known as the Code Noir, which restricted the activities of free people of color, not just Africans, and mandated conversion to Catholicism for all enslaved people throughout the French Empire. The code also defined the punishment that would be meted out to them and ordered the expulsion of all Jewish people from France's colonies. And the law also forbade interracial relations. Then, about 15, 17 years later, the French Empire would found the colony of Louisiana in North America, which you can see here. And then, about 16 years after that, in 1718 CE, the city of New Orleans would be founded in New France, within the colony of Louisiana. Then, just 1 year after, in 1719 CE, the French Empire would institutionalize African chattel slavery in Louisiana and would begin importing enslaved Africans from Angola, Congo, Mali, and Senegal, among other places, into Louisiana. And you can see a map of the various places in which the French Empire and other European empires captured and forcibly imported enslaved Africans from into the Americas. In fact, many of the enslaved Africans imported by the French Empire were actually captured soldiers from the Kingdom of Congo. After African chattel slavery was institutionalized, cotton and indigo would become the main cash crops of the colony of Louisiana. And you can see, in fact, some indigo processing here and here. And then here are some cotton. Here's a picture of cotton itself, and here's a picture of cotton plantations. Also here and here. And it is always, as I always like to point out, it is very important to realize that African chattel slavery was an incredibly brutal institution, with enslaved Africans being punished for any minor infraction, uh, with these punishments being incredibly severe and including things such as being beat while tied up by wooden paddles that say had spikes on them or holes in them. And then, of course, the more famous and well known, or I should say more infamous and well known, whipping, also known as lashing, which would often lead, uh, more often than not, actually, would leave uh, deep scarring, as you can see here. And white enslavers from the various European empires, including the French Empire, would often force other enslaved Africans to perform these punishments themselves as a way of keeping control over over their enslaved Africans, and a way of also a way of instilling helplessness. And then also another very, very common practice within the institution of African chattel slavery was the selling apart of entire families, such as children being sold away from their parents, and spouses being sold away from each other. Despite the Code Noir, white French aristocrats would occasionally have romantic relationships with free Africans, and white French enslavers would most certainly often rape enslaved African women. Um, and it wasn't just white French enslavers either, it was also white American enslavers, white British enslavers, etc. And these would result in mixed race children who would eventually become known in French colonies as Afro-Creoles. Many French white enslavers would actually eventually free their Afro-Creole children and their mothers, though not all did this, and many Afro-Creole children would remain enslaved and would continue to be treated brutally. Uh, Once this began to happen, French Louisiana would develop a strict caste system or three-tiered society with white French aristocrats and white French Creoles at the top, and mixed race Creoles and Native Americans in the middle, and then both white French peasants and enslaved Africans at the bottom. Then in 1763 CE, the Spanish Empire would cede Florida to the British Empire after losing the Seven Years' War. To balance the Spanish Empire's loss of Florida, the Spanish Empire would gain most of what had been French Louisiana. Then in 1776 3E, just 13 years later, the American Revolution would begin between the 13 British colonies and the British Empire, with the British Empire siding with the 13 British colonies. Uh, and as part of this alliance, the Spanish Empire would gather a force, including 80 Afro Creoles, to defend the Fort Baton Rouge against the British Empire between September 12th and September 21st, 1779 CE. And eventually, the 13 British colonies would win the American Revolution and eventually form the United States, though not immediately. They wouldn't form the United States until 7 years after the American Revolution in 1789 CE, but that's a subject for another video. Uh, then, shortly after the end of the American Revolution, many Afro Creoles would be able to accumulate wealth and become landowners and purchase enslaved Africans of their own, such as Marie Theresa Coin and her son Nicolas Augustin Metoyer, named after his father Claude Thomas Pierre Metoyer. and they would both found a prosperous Augustine Metier and Concoin would both found a prosperous Afro-Creole community on the Cane River and the French outpost of uh, Natchitoches. Concoin and Augustine Metier would expand the colony for the next decade and a half before Concoin eventually died at the age of 74, with all this happening between 1787 and 1816 CE. One of the main sources of wealth for the Cane River Afro-Creole communities, in addition to indigo, cotton, and other crops produced at plantations, was actually cattle ranching. Uh, and in fact, the Cane River Afro-Creoles would manage their cattle herds, using open range ranching techniques that derived from traditional West African pastoralism, something that is discussed in depth by Andrew Sliter in his paper in the journal, the Agricultural Historical Society, titled "The Role of Blacks in Establishing Cattle Ranching in Louisiana in the 18th Century." And here's a map within that paper showing the distribution of open range cattle herding in West Africa. Uh, in addition to this, to owning plantations and cattle ranching, many Afro-Creole individuals were also able to amass wealth working in professions such as shoemakers, cigar makers, and iron workers. And many Afro-Creole individuals were also able to gain an education by attending universities in France or by their parents hiring private tutors. Uh, Furthermore, many free Africans and Afro-Creole people within French Louisiana would intermarry with individuals from Native American nations such as the Caddo Nation and the Choctaw Nation. And of course, they would also do this in Spanish Louisiana and eventually in the state of Louisiana in the United States. Unfortunately, however, despite their wealth and education, Afro-Creole individuals were still considered second-class citizens within colonial French society, below wealthy white French citizens, and eventually wealthy white Spanish and American citizens. Then, between 1791 and 1803 CE, enslaved Africans in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, or Saint-Domingue, seeking freedom, would ignite the Haitian Revolution. This would lead many white French enslavers to flee the colony and attempt to establish similar lucrative sugarcane plantations on the Gulf Coast, resulting in a dense population of enslaved Africans and African Americans. They would convert the plantation economy in the region from cotton and indigo plantations to sugarcane plantations, while also replicating the same brutal conditions which led to the numerous revolts on Saint Domingue, um, eventually called Haiti. The high profits from these plantations would be made by working enslaved Africans and African Americans longer hours and punishing them more brutally than even than even the brutal punishments that were already present in the Gulf Coast. And this would leave them to lead enslaved Africans and African Americans to live shorter lives than any other enslaved African or African American society in North America. Then, in 1803 CE, Napoleon Bonaparte would sell Louisiana to the United States in the very famous Louisiana Purchase to pay for his war effort in Haiti. And I've already done a video on the Louisiana Purchase that I will include in the iCard. Now this brings us to the next section, the Afro-Creole people in the United States and the Antebellum South. So for one thing, the Afro during this time in the initial years upon which Louisiana entered the United States, the Afro-Creole population in Louisiana would continue to increase, with refugees from Saint-Domingue and their enslaved African Americans entering the United States, and Africans entering the United States through ports such as New Orleans, following the successful Haitian Revolution and the establishment of the Republic of Haiti. And all this would happen between 1803 to sometime between 1809 to 1810 CE. Of course, finding a definite end to this migration is very difficult. Then, between January 10th and 11th of 1811 CE, inspired by the Haitian Revolution, a group of enslaved Africans and African Americans, many of whom were former soldiers of the Kingdom of Congo, would ignite the largest rebellion by enslaved Africans and African Americans in the history of the United States. The rebels would travel along Louisiana's German coast, heading toward New Orleans, burning any plantation in their path. However, white American enslavers were able to rally militias and brutally put down the rebellion. And I've already done an in-depth video on the German Coast Uprising that I will include in the iCard. After the German Coast Uprising, the white American enslavers of Louisiana would use propaganda to depict the rebels as mere savage bandits instead of brutally enslaved people fighting for their freedom. This would begin nearly 2 centuries where the German Coast Uprising was ignored and relegated to obscurity. Again, I have already done an in-depth video on this that I will include in the iCard. Another one of the main side effects of the German Coast Uprising, as well as other rebellions by enslaved Africans and African Americans, would be that white American enslavers in Louisiana, as well as the rest of the United States, would invest more money into trained militias. In addition to this, slave patrols would begin surveilling Africans and African Americans, both free and enslaved, with increasing frequency, and the ability for Africans and African Americans to gather unsupervised would be severely limited by white American enslavers. And then the final side effect of the German Coast Uprising would be that the federal government would commit to defending the institution of African chattel slavery by inducting Louisiana into the United States as a slave state on April 30th, 1812 CE. Shortly before the United States would go to war against the British Empire in the War of 1812 CE. During this conflict, uh, and especially during the Battle of New Orleans, Afro-Creole militias would play an integral role, specifically playing an integral role in the Battle of New Orleans by manning the United States Army's artillery alongside French pirates led by Jean and Pierre Lafitte. And to be fair, these cannons were actually cannons provided to the United States by Jean and Pierre Lafitte. And this battle would happen on January 8th, 1815 CE. And then on February 17th, 1815 CE, the War of 1812 would end with a British strategic victory, though the United States claimed and still claims to this day that the war was a stalemate. Uh, After the War of 1812, while they were able to maintain their wealth and remain enslavers, the Afro-Creole peoples of Louisiana would increasingly lose much of their status. Uh, this was seen in Creole individuals being unable to vote, Afro-Creole individuals often losing legal challenges, and even the most minor court case, and Afro-Creole peoples being subject to the black codes of the southern United States. And then this would be further exacerbated by the Panic of 1837 CE, which would lead to an economic depression within the United States, with many wealthy Louisiana citizens witnessing a decline in wealth, including wealthy Afro-Creole families. Though it's also important to note that it would not completely decimate their wealth, and many Afro-Creole families were able, including the Cane River Creoles, would be able to maintain a sizable chunk of their wealth, though still considerably less wealthy than before the panic. And this panic would happen between May 10th, 1837 and into the mid 1840s CE. And I've already done an in-depth video on the Jacksonian Age, where the Panic of 1837 happened, as well as the War of 1812 that I will include in the iCard. As a result of the Panic of 1837 CE and the racial inequalities of the antebellum South, many Afro-Creole families would migrate to ethnically dominated outskirts of larger cities in the United States and Europe, where racial inequalities were less strict. And these would happen in the sometime in the mid 1840s, all the way through the 1890s CE. All right, now this brings us to our next section, Afro-Creole culture, starting with Afro-Creole cuisine. So, Afro-Creole food is made up of traditional West African foods, many of which are now staples of Southern food in the modern era. These include okra, kidney beans, black-eyed peas, and watermelon, all of which are indigenous to Africa. Though it is also important to note, Afro-Creole food also incorporates foods indigenous to the Americas, such as tomato, peppers, and Native American spices, such as filet. Afro-Creole food also incorporates seafood, such as shrimp and oysters, and meat such as smoked ham and chicken. All of which can be used along with the African and indigenous American ingredients to make Creole dishes, which include things such as jambalaya and gumbo. And then all Louisiana Creole cuisine, including Afro-Creole cuisine, incorporates Afro-Caribbean foods such as beignets, which were imported to the United States from the Caribbean, probably when white French enslavers fled the colony of Saint Domingue during the Haitian Revolution. But what's important to note is that even though these things were imported from the Caribbean, beignets themselves were actually originally inspired by traditional West African pastries. All right, now this brings us to the Afro-Creole religion. So, initially, many imported enslaved Africans were Muslim or polytheistic. Though it is also important to note that also many of the imported enslaved Africans, especially those from the Kingdom of Congo, were also Catholic Christian. And this would eventually lead to the gradual conversion of enslaved and free African Americans who were not Christian, to uh, convert to Christianity. That being said, despite the conversion to Christianity, many Afro-Creole peoples, both free and enslaved, uh, began to develop a new religion in the form of Louisiana Voodoo. The new religion would syncretize and still syncretizes traditional West African and Christian religious practices with Haitian Voodoo practices that were imported to the United States after the Haitian Revolution. And you can see some of their items here and here and here. Now this brings us to Afro-Creole contributions to the arts. So starting off, during the Antebellum South, many Afro-Creole individuals contributed extensively to literary collections by writing novels and plays, such as one Victor Séjour, who would write works such as the short story Les Mulâtres or the Mulatto. And also during the 19th century, several Afro-Creole individuals would become prominent classical musicians, such as Edmund Dede um, and Arditi and Victor Eugene McCarty. Then, more famously than all of these, in the 20th century, many Afro-Creole individuals would have defining roles in the rise of jazz, blues, and zydeco. And this would include individuals such as Sidney Bechet for the rise of jazz, Clifton Chenier for the rise of blues, and sorry, for the rise of zydeco, and King Oliver for the rise of blues. All right, now this brings us to our next section, the Afro-Creole peoples in the era of the American Civil War. So, starting off, in December 20th, 1860 CE, South Carolina would secede from the United States to defend the institution of African chattel slavery, and Louisiana would follow on January 26th, 1861 CE, with both states joining the newly created Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy. Uh, as war between the United States and the Confederate States became increasingly likely, many Afro Creole families would sell their property and flee to European countries such as France and also Belgium between 1860 and 1861 CE. Then, between on April 12th and April 13th, 1861 CE, the Confederacy would attack the United States Fort Sumter, officially beginning the American Civil War. Then the United States Navy would quickly blockade southern ports as part of General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan. And as part of this plan, the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, would be captured on April 25th, 1862 CE. And here's a map of a depiction of the Anaconda Plan. Then, in response to this, many Afro-Creole groups in Louisiana would begin to worry about losing their identity and social position as white Americans did not legally recognize Louisiana's three-tiered society. As a result, Alexander Dmitri and his son John Bull Smith Dmitri would create the Confederate Louisiana Native Guards, which was made up completely of Afro-Creole volunteers. However, the unit would never see action and would be quickly disbanded. I do want to note that this absolutely does not prove the myth of Black Confederates, as this was only a small unit that was only temporarily created and participated in no battles. Furthermore, the myth of the Black Confederates has been thoroughly disproven by academics, and any enslaved African Americans who did travel with the Confederate Army were not there by choice. And the in actually case in point, the Louisiana Native Guards only existed between May 1861 and April 1862 CE. In contrast to the Afro Creole individuals who sought to maintain their social status as enslavers, such as Alexander Dmitri, other prominent Afro Creole individuals, such as Juan Victor Sejour, would support the emancipation of enslaved Africans and African Americans. To accomplish this, the Federal Louisiana Native Guards would be created, and this unit would assist the United States in its invasion and eventual occupation of Louisiana, with this unit lasting considerably longer than its predecessor, and the Confederate version of the Louisiana Native Guards, with this unit lasting between 1862 and 1864 CE. And of course, the United States Army would eventually invade Louisiana, defeating the Confederate Army in multiple key battles and eventually completely occupying Louisiana. In the process, the United States Army would destroy much of the Confederate infrastructure, including manufacturing power, and economic power. This would include the destruction of many plantations, including Afro-Creole plantations. This destruction would further decrease the wealth and status of the Afro-Creole peoples of Louisiana. With this invasion and occupation happening between October 12th, 1861 and May 16th, 1864 CE. Also, around the same time, the Ku Klux Klan would form and would begin to terrorize African Americans in the South, with this happening between 1865 and the 1870s CE. And here are what the Ku Klux Klan looked like in the Reconstruction South. Uh, Meanwhile, in the wake of the American Civil War, the Louisiana three-tiered society would be gradually undermined by white Americans who would classify everyone by the South's binary division of black and white. This would further erode the status of the Afro-Creole peoples of Louisiana, with all of this happening between the 1860s and 1890s CE. However, there would be some hope as in 1866 CE, the African Americans would be granted the right to vote in the Civil Rights Act of 1866 CE. However, at the same time this act was being passed, um, on July 30th, 1866 CE, a mob of white former Confederate soldiers would attack a group of emancipated African Americans. The mob would kill between 34 and 200 of the demonstrators in what would become known as the New Orleans Massacre. Then in 1867 CE, Congress would overturn Johnson's decisions and would initiate the military reconstruction of the South. During this time period, Afro-Creole politician John Willis Maynard would be elected as a Republican to represent Louisiana's second congressional district in 1868 CE. However, he would be denied the seat on the basis of an election challenge by the apparent loser, a white American Democrat named Caleb S. Hunt. After much debate, neither individual would become the district's representative. Later, Maynard would move to Jacksonville, Florida, where he would be successfully appointed to the Florida House of Representatives in 1874 CE. Then, on September 28, 1868 CE, tensions between African American Republicans and white American Democrats would lead to the outbreak of violent attacks by white supremacist groups against African Americans in Opelousas, Louisiana. These attacks would result in the deaths of between 150 and 300 African Americans and the complete elimination of the Republican Party in Opelousas. This event would become known as the Opelousas Massacre. Uh, then, in 1873 CE, African Creole politician C.C. Antoine and former Confederate General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard would start the Louisiana Unification Movement, with this movement calling for complete political equality for African Americans and equal division of state offices between the races, and a plan where African Americans would become landowners. The movement would also denounce discrimination because of color in hiring laborers or in selecting directors of corporations, and would call for the abandonment of segregation in public conveyances, public places, railroads, steamboats, and public schools. Beauregard would actually argue that, quote, African Americans already have equality, and white Americans have to accept that hard fact. Though it is important to note, very important to note, that Toutant Beauregard is the exception to Confederate generals, not the rule. Unfortunately, the lost cause myth would have a lot of people believe that many Confederate generals felt the same as Beauregard, but that was just simply not the case. Most of them very much wanted the institution of African chattel slavery to stay in place and very much viewed uh, enslaved Africans, Americans, and free African Americans as their inferiors. Then, on March 1st, 1875 CE, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 would be passed by the United States Senate, with the act guaranteeing that everyone, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, was entitled to the same treatment in public accommodations such as inns, public transportation, theaters, and other places of recreation. However, this act had little effect in practice. Uh, Meanwhile, And also, despite the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1875 CE, the Redeemers and the Bourbon Triumvirate would lead Southern Democrats to retake the Senate and House of Representatives, and would eventually lead to the end of Reconstruction in the South. I already have done an in-depth video on Reconstruction that I will include in the iCard. Then, in 1883 CE, the Supreme Court would declare much of the Civil Rights Act of 1875 CE unconstitutional. Uh, right after this, just 2 years later, on between November 22nd and November 25th, 1887 CE, during a protest in Thibodaux, Louisiana, by 10,000 sugarcane workers protesting the horrible living and working conditions that existed on sugarcane plantations. Um, Violence would erupt when an unknown white American man would enter an African American owned bar room and killed, upon entering, one African American laborer while wounding another. Afterwards, five town guards would be attacked and wounded. This would then result in paramilitary white supremacist groups attacking and killing between 35 and 50 African Americans in what would become known as the Thibodaux Massacre. Then in 1890 CE, the Louisiana state legislature would pass the Separate Car Act, which required the segregation of train car accommodations into equal but separate sections for African Americans and white Americans. And if that sounds very familiar, you're very much correct, because this was indeed one of the several predecessors to the Jim Crow South, which would officially begin in 1896 when the Supreme Court ruled that the segregation of white Americans and other minority groups, including African Americans, was legal in the court case Plessy versus Ferguson, which again would officially begin the Jim Crow South. After the ruling of the ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, white Creoles would begin to distance themselves from the multiracial Creole communities, including Afro-Creole communities, with white Creoles deliberately erasing or destroying public records, and many officially passing over fully into a white American identity. Meanwhile, in the Jim Crow South, African Americans and other minority groups would be segregated, with schools, bathrooms, and buses, among other places, being separated by race. The facilities used by these minority groups would usually be underfunded and dilapidated. Uh, in addition to this, while they had the right to vote, minority groups were often blocked from voting through the use of intimidation and other methods such as poll taxes. As a result of the inequalities of the Jim Crow South, many minority groups, including Afro-Creoles in Louisiana, would begin to move to northern states where society was slightly more equal. This event would become known as the First Great Migration, which would happen between 1910 and 1940 CE, though some argue for a slightly later beginning of it in 1916 CE. The first Great Migration would lead many Afro-Creole families to found new communities in northern and west coast cities such as Chicago and Los Angeles. Then, in October of 1929 CE, the United States stock market would crash, leading to an economic downturn known as the Great Depression. The Great Depression itself would then lead to nationwide economic decline and hardship, with the Great Depression lasting between 1929 and 1939 CE. During the Great Depression, the Afro-Creole communities of Louisiana would continue to fight for their status, continuing to fight for their status for decades. However, their status would be almost completely eroded when the Louisiana Supreme Court ruled in the case Sinceri v. Cassian. I may have butchered that. I apologize. that the traceability of African ancestry was the only requirement for the definition of colored. This would fully segregate the Afro-Creole communities of Louisiana into the Jim Crow South, with this case officially being ruled, uh, with decision officially being ruled in 1938 CE. Then, after World War II, a second, much larger wave of African Americans would begin to migrate to the northern states and the West Coast in what would become known as the Second Great Migration, with this happening between 1945 and 1970 CE. Though, as you can see in this map here, one could argue that it happened much earlier, about 15 years earlier in 1930, and continued about 10 years later into 1980 CE. Then, between 1949 and 1965 CE, while she was working as the registrar of the Bureau of Vital Statistics for the city of New Orleans, Naomi Drake would try to impose the Jim Crow South's binary racial classifications on the multiracial Creole communities of Louisiana, including the Afro-Creole communities. She did this by altering records to classify mixed race individuals as solely African American if she found they had any African heritage, and also did not notify any of the people of her actions. Now, of course, this did not mean they did not ever find out. Some people, well, many people certainly did find out. Um, After all, you have to go, pull your records at some point. And of course, unsurprisingly, not everyone accepted Drake's actions upon discovery. This would lead to thousands of cases being filed against the office to have racial classifications changed and to protest her withholding legal documents of vital records. This would cause New Orleans much embarrassment and disruption, finally causing the city to fire her in 1965 CE. During all of this, um, and I imagine Naomi did this in spite of this. The Supreme Court would declare the racial segregation of public schools unconstitutional in the court case Brown v. the Board of Education. However, it's important to note racial segregation as a whole did not end, and this court case would be made. This court decision would be made on May 17th, 1954 CE. Which was the same time that the civil rights movement would begin, with Louisiana becoming one of the states at the forefront of the civil rights movement, seeing multiple protests, including the Canal Street sit-ins in New Orleans on September 9th, 1960 CE, and the Bogalusa to Baton Rouge March from August 10th to August 20th, 1967 CE. Then on August 6th, 1965 CE, Lyndon B. Johnson would sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965 CE into law. And then on April 11th, 1968 CE, President Lyndon B. Johnson would sign the Equal Rights Act of 1968 CE into law, officially ending the Jim Crow era. However, it is important to note that the effects of the Jim Crow era are still very much felt in the modern era. All right, now this leads us to our last section, the Afro-Creole people in the post-Jim Crow South. So, for one thing, Louisiana's Creole peoples, including Afro-Creoles, continue to live in Louisiana into the modern day, mainly centered around these areas you see here on this map. Then between 1981 and 2022 CE, Afro-Creole poet, playwright, and scholar Sybil Kine, also known as Consuela Provost, would reignite public interest in the culture and history of Louisiana's Creole peoples, uh, where she would write multiple scholarly works on the history of Louisiana's Creole peoples, such as the book Creole: The History and Legacy of Louisiana's Free People of Color, which is one of the sources I used for this video. Then, after the destruction caused by Hurricane Katrina, Many Louisiana Creole families would move to cities such as Los Angeles after August of 2005 CE. And it is important to note Louisiana's Creole peoples, including the Afro-Creole peoples, uh, have held and continue to hold cultural festivals to share and educate the public on their culture and history. All right, with that, that ends our second video for this year's Black History Month. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Afro-Creole peoples of Louisiana. If you would like me to cover any of the subjects that I mentioned in the video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.